To talk a lot more and break down what we just sort of learned there, I want to bring into the conversation legal analyst Neama Rahmani. Neama, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. Of course, when it comes to some of these SNAP issues, it really hits home for people. We were just listening into that press conference with that man talking about he's disabled, he's on a fixed income, and these SNAP benefits are not coming. What did we just now learn through the court system as the government still remains shut down at this hour?
Thanks for having me, Christina. And like you said, more than 42 million Americans do receive these benefits, 1 in 8 people in the United States. So this is a big deal for a lot of folks. So let's talk about the latest developments today in the legal case. So yesterday, the judge, like you said, ordered the federal government, specifically the Department of Agriculture, to dip into another pool of money. It's called Section 32 WIC, commonly referred to as Women, Infants, and Children. So this is a separate pool of money. There's $23 billion there. And the judge said, you have to dip into this other pool to pay the SNAP benefits. Why does that matter? Well, that program typically costs the government about $3 billion a month. So there's a lot of money there that can come backfill this shortfall. We know the SNAP program costs the federal government approximately $8.5 to $9 billion a month. So this additional money could potentially fund the program through the end of the year. Now, the federal government is saying that this is unlawful. You can't force the government to pull from one pool of money to pay for another. Now, this Section 32 program, it was funded by 1932 congressional law called the Agriculture Adjustment Act. And the second argument that the government is making is that this is a judge telling Congress to appropriate funds and to spend money. And the nonprofits that sued in the cities, they said, no, this money has already been apportioned. It just has to be spent. And the USDA is refusing to do so. Today, the government filed an appeal and asked for an emergency stay. A stay would be putting that lower court's ruling on hold. And the First Circuit Court of Appeals, they declined to do so. So as we're speaking right now, Christina, that order is in place. The government must fund the SNAP program. And Pam Bondi said that the department is going to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. So we'll see if the justices weigh in and put that lower court ruling on hold. Otherwise, SNAP benefits should be flowing to millions of Americans.
That's really interesting, Neama, because there are people who were expecting that money to be on their card a week ago. They're now expecting, some of them who had the date set as today, that their cards would be refilled. But it seems like the legal aspect of this is still able to hold up those funds during that process. What allows for that? Is that just the nature of the court system now that they're trying to take this all the way to the Supreme Court?
So there's two issues going on. The first is the position that the Trump administration took in these cases. First, they said that they're not going to pay any benefits. Then they said they're going to pay 50%. Then they said they're not going to pay. Then they said they're going to pay 65% because there wasn't enough money. It was just that initial contingency fee fund that we talked about last week, which was supposed to be spent on emergencies, natural disasters. That was only $5 billion. So that's not enough to get through the end of November. So some of it was the back and forth with the administration, whether they're going to follow this order, whether they were going to appeal it. We obviously had 2 different cases, one pending in Massachusetts that was filed by the states, and the cities and nonprofits filed in Rhode Island, which we're talking about here. But there's also procedural hurdles, Christina, because even though the federal government funds this, it's not something that the federal government administers themselves. They give this money to the states, and the states have to provide it to their residents. So there's a whole administrative layer. In states like California, the funds are provided on these electronic cards. So even if the federal government turns on the funding, it still has to go to the states, and there's still this process that can take days or even longer. So even though the government has said that they would partially fund it while this litigation plays out, there's many people that have received no benefits whatsoever, or really pennies on the dollar for what they would otherwise be owed. That's why Judge McConnell's decision is so important, because what he said is the full program needs to be funded 100%. So if his ruling sticks and the Supreme Court doesn't step in and the government follows that order, everyone should be receiving their SNAP benefits in a matter of days.
I'm interested to learn a little bit more about that, but I also want to put this up on the screen for folks at home. This is from the New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy saying this morning following a federal court order, the U.S. Department of Agriculture finally made funding for November SNAP benefits available. They said that they acted immediately there in the state to process full SNAP benefits to eligible residents. I thank the court for intervening, and I applaud all who stepped up, especially for our food banks and community kitchens who mobilized quickly on the front lines to mitigate the impact of this avoidable crisis. And it's not just there in New Jersey, as you were mentioning there, Neama, that we're seeing this. Officials from California, Wisconsin, Kansas, and Pennsylvania said that full SNAP benefits were already available to some of those recipients. Kathy Hochul said that she had also directed the state agencies to issue those full benefits. You were speaking there. What happens, though, towards the end of the month? So with this money that's already been allocated to the states, they've sent it out. Could they still be in a holding pattern if this issue isn't ultimately resolved?
They can. So what some states did is preemptively pay the funds out of the state budgets, anticipating that the federal government would reimburse them at some point. That way, folks wouldn't go hungry. There are other states that have been waiting for the federal government to issue those funds before they started paying the benefits. That's why you see very different outcomes in each state, because again, it's not a federally administered program. And you have states that have been preemptively starting to pay people, drawing from other parts of state budgets to make sure folks don't go hungry. And I know it's very frustrating. I'm sure people that are watching are having a difficult time making sense of all this, because they're hearing things on social media. They have loved ones and friends in other states that are receiving full benefits, but they might not be. There's this litigation that is playing out in multiple states and in multiple courts of appeal. I think ultimately what really needs to happen, Christina, is the Supreme Court needs to weigh in. I mean, this is such an important issue that affects so many Americans. So hopefully now that that First Circuit emergency stay has been denied, the Supreme Court can weigh in and say, listen, do we want to put this lower judge's order on hold, pause it, or do we want to decline to do so? Declining to act is essentially like acting. I'm not saying that this case won't necessarily have a different outcome down the road, but really this is a national emergency. So the conservative Supreme Court says that we're going to keep this lower order in place. I would fully expect the USDA to issue 100% of these SNAP benefits, to pull from those WIC resources like Judge McConnell asked for, and to fund these benefits again for the next couple of months.
And Neama, I would like to know, so if the government is reopened today, they just held a vote not too long ago there in the Senate. Of course, we know that they're expected to be back there on the Senate floor at noon tomorrow. If the government reopens, does this all go away, or will this continue to go up the chain until there's resolution that may impact future shutdowns if they're to occur?
Potentially, yes. There's 3 ways for people to get their SNAP benefits if the government opens, and 2 ways if they don't. The 2 ways that if they don't, is if a judge orders the USDA to pay these funds to the state and they're paid, or the state decides to pay them on their own. The 3 ways people can get their SNAP benefits if the government reopens is, 1, if Congress passes a comprehensive spending bill. I think that's going to take quite some time. The second way would be if there's a continuing resolution that just continues the previous payments made before the shutdown. That's typically what happens. The third way, and given that this is such an important issue, is that Congress passes a standalone bill related to SNAP benefits and food stamps, and it goes through both chambers of Congress and is passed and signed by the president. So those are the 3 ways: comprehensive spending bill, continuing resolution, or a standalone bill that folks can get their SNAP benefits if and when the government reopens.
All right, it'll certainly be something that we're continuing to watch here on Live Now from Fox. Neama Rahmani here with us. Neama, anything that we missed, or we're just going to have to hang on and wait, as you've kind of been saying, we're in this holding pattern?
I think we're gonna have to hang on and wait, but really all eyes should be on the Supreme Court. Pam Bondi is gonna appeal. If the justices step in, they can easily change that order one way or another. And of course, the Supreme Court is really the law of the land, and they should be doing this as opposed to having this very important issue being litigated in different courts throughout the country.
All right, we'll see if it makes its way up there to the Supreme Court. Of course, legal analyst Neama Rahmani here with the very latest to help us break that down. Thanks so much for being there.
Thanks, Christina. Talk to you soon.